Most people misunderstand empaths in a very predictable way. When they see someone with a small social circle, they assume there's a problem, like a lack of social skill or confidence, but in reality, it's usually the opposite. Empaths don't struggle to connect. They struggle to ignore what they notice. When they do, they pick up on tone, hesitation, and the subtle mismatch between what people say and what they actually feel. And once you start seeing those patterns consistently, social interaction stops feeling casual. It starts to feel scripted, surface level, even artificial. Conversations that seem normal to others begin to feel incomplete. That's where the shift happens. Not from inability, but from awareness, because once someone experiences connection at that level, they don't want more interaction. They want something real. And when that becomes the standard, most connections simply don't meet it anymore. What separates empaths from most people isn't that they feel more in a vague or abstract way, it's that they process social information at a different depth in any interaction. While most people are focused on the surface layer, the words being said, the general tone of the conversation, the obvious emotional cues, an empath is automatically tracking multiple layers at once. They notice the delay before someone answers a question, the slight tightening around the eyes when a smile appears, the inconsistency between a confident statement and a hesitant tone. These are not dramatic signals. They're subtle, often barely perceptible, but when you accumulate enough of them, they form a pattern, and that pattern tells a very different story than the one being presented on the surface. This is why empathic perception often feels less like intuition and more like silent analysis. It's not guesswork. It's pattern recognition happening in real time, below conscious awareness, but strong enough to shape how the interaction feels. Over time, this creates a very specific kind of awareness. Instead of taking conversations at face value, empaths begin to experience them as layered exchanges where meaning is constantly shifting beneath the words. Someone says, "I'm fine," but the body language contradicts it. Someone laughs, but the timing is off, slightly delayed, like it's filling space rather than expressing genuine amusement. Someone agrees outwardly, but their posture signals resistance. Most people either don't notice these inconsistencies or choose to ignore them because focusing on them would complicate the interaction. Empaths don't have that option. Once you see the mismatch, you can't unsee it. And the more it happens, the harder it becomes to treat the interaction as simple or straightforward. This is where small talk starts to break down. For most people, surface-level conversation serves a social function. It maintains connection without requiring depth. But for an empath, it can feel disorienting, not because the topics are unimportant, but because the interaction often lacks alignment. The words say one thing, the emotional undercurrent says something else, and the empath is left holding both at the same time. That creates friction. It feels like participation, and after enough exposure to that dynamic, the experience stops being neutral. It becomes draining in a very specific way, not physically exhausting, but mentally and emotionally unsatisfying. A pattern starts to form. Conversations become predictable, not incontent. But in structure, there's a repetition to how people present themselves, how they avoid certain topics, how they maintain a version of themselves that fits the situation. Empaths begin to recognize these patterns quickly, sometimes within minutes of meeting someone. And while that might sound like an advantage, it comes with a cost, because once you can anticipate the trajectory of an interaction, Once you know where it's going before it gets there, it becomes difficult to stay engaged. There's no sense of discovery, no sense of authenticity unfolding in real time. It feels contained, controlled, and often disconnected from what's actually happening beneath the surface. This doesn't mean empaths are constantly judging or analyzing people in a critical way. In many cases, it's the opposite. They understand why people behave this way. They see the underlying insecurity, the need for approval, the fear of being fully seen. That awareness often creates empathy rather than judgment, but understanding the reason doesn't remove the effect. The mismatch is still there. The lack of alignment is still felt, and over time, that repeated experience changes how empaths approach interaction altogether. They stop looking for quantity, for constant engagement, for social activity. As a default, instead, they start looking for moments where the surface and the underlying reality actually match, where what someone says, how they feel, and how they present themselves are aligned, and that standard is not easy to meet. Genuine emotional congruence is rare. Most people operate with some degree of filtering, adjusting, or masking depending on context. For an empath, that creates a natural divide. It's not that they consciously decide to withdraw from people. It's that fewer and fewer interactions feel worth the investment when you're constantly aware of what's missing, what's being avoided, what's not being said. Surface level connection doesn't just feel shallow, it feels incomplete. And when something feels incomplete often enough, the mind starts to look for alternatives. That's the beginning of the shift, not a dramatic withdrawal, not a rejection of people, but a quiet recalibration of standards. The empath starts to value alignment over activity, depth over frequency, authenticity over social comfort. They become less interested in filling space with conversation and more interested in whether the interaction actually reflects something real. And when that becomes the internal baseline, it changes everything that comes after. Social behavior becomes more selective, attention becomes more focused, and the number of interactions that truly resonate begins to narrow, not because connection is difficult, but because meaningful connection, the kind that meets that level of perception, is simply not as common as most people assume. There's a point most empaths reach that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but internally it changes everything. It doesn't happen all at once, and it's rarely something they can clearly explain at the time. It's more like a slow accumulation of moments where something feels slightly off, slightly out of sync. Until that feeling becomes impossible to ignore, they can be sitting in a completely normal social setting, surrounded by people, engaged in conversation, and yet there's a quiet awareness in the background that what's happening on the surface doesn't fully match what's being felt underneath. The conversation flows, people respond at the right moments, laughter appears where it's expected, but for the empath, there's a noticeable gap between performance and reality, and once that gap becomes visible, it starts to interfere with the experience itself. This is what Lech Tunso really feels like in practice. It's not about being socially awkward or unable to engage. It's about perceiving a layer of inconsistency that others either don't detect or choose not to focus on. While most people are comfortable operating within the structure of social norms, saying the right things, maintaining a certain tone, keeping interactions smooth, the empath is simultaneously registering the undercurrent. They notice when someone agrees verbally but resists non-verbally, when enthusiasm sounds slightly forced, When attention drifts, even if the words suggest interest, these aren't major disruptions, but they create a subtle friction that builds over time. And the more frequently this happens, the harder it becomes to stay fully present in the interaction. At first, many empaths try to override this perception. They tell themselves they're overthinking, that this is just how people communicate, that not every conversation needs to be deep or perfectly aligned. And to some extent, that's true. But the issue isn't depth, it's coherence. When what is said and what is felt consistently diverge, the interaction begins to feel unstable. It's like trying to follow a conversation where part of the signal is always distorted. You can still understand the words, but the clarity is gone. And over time, that lack of clarity becomes more exhausting than the conversation itself. This is where the internal conflict starts to form. On one side, there's a natural desire to connect, to be part of a group, to participate in shared experiences. On the other side, there's a growing awareness that many of those experiences don't feel genuine. The empath is faced with a choice, often without realizing it consciously. Continue engaging in interactions that feel misaligned, or start stepping back and conserving energy for something that feels real. Neither option is entirely comfortable. Staying requires a level of tolerance for inconsistency that gradually becomes draining. Stepping back creates distance. And from the outside, that distance can be misinterpreted. Most empaths begin to reduce their engagement in subtle ways. They speak less, listen more, not out of shyness, but because they're evaluating whether the interaction is worth investing in. They start declining invitations that once felt routine. They leave conversations earlier than they used to. They become more selective, not in an obvious or confrontational way, but in small, consistent decisions that slowly reshape their social behavior. To others, it may look like withdrawal or loss of interest, but internally, it's a form of calibration. They're adjusting their level of participation based on how aligned the interaction feels. What makes this phase particularly complex is that it often happens without clear validation from the outside. Most people don't experience social interaction this way, so they don't recognize the pattern the empath is responding to. Instead, they may assume something else is going on. Stress, introversion, mood changes, or even disinterest in relationships altogether, but the empath knows the difference. Even if they can't fully articulate it yet, it's not that they don't want connection, it's that the kind of connection available in many situations doesn't match what they're capable of perceiving. Over time, this repeated experience reshapes expectations. The empath no longer assumes that every interaction will be fulfilling, and they stop trying to force it to be. They become more comfortable with silence, with space, with stepping outside of constant social engagement, and this is where the shift becomes visible. Their world gets quieter, not necessarily lonelier, but more controlled. They are no longer reacting automatically to social opportunities. They are choosing them based on a different set of criteria. Alignment starts to matter more than inclusion. Authenticity matters more than participation. And once that internal standard is established, it's difficult to reverse, because going back to constant, surface-level interaction doesn't just feel uninteresting. It feels inaccurate. It feels like ignoring information that is clearly present. So the empath adapts not by disconnecting entirely, but by changing how and where they connect. Fewer interactions, but more intentional ones, less noise, more clarity, And while that shift might look like distance from the outside, from the inside, it feels like the first time things are actually making sense. Once that sense of misalignment becomes consistent, something starts to change in a way that is both subtle and irreversible. The empath doesn't make a dramatic decision to cut people off or withdraw from the world. There's no single moment where everything shifts. Instead, it's a gradual process where their behavior begins to adjust in response to what they've been noticing all along. They start paying closer attention to how they feel during and after interactions, not just what was said or how things appeared on the surface. And that awareness becomes a filter, not a conscious checklist, but a natural internal response that begins to determine where their time and energy go. At first, the changes are small. They stop forcing themselves to stay in conversations that feel one-dimensional. They no longer laugh automatically when something isn't genuinely funny. They become less inclined to fill silence just to keep an interaction going. These are minor shifts on the surface, but they signal something deeper. The empath is no longer prioritizing social flow over internal alignment. They're no longer adjusting themselves to maintain the interaction at any cost, and once that adjustment stops, the dynamic begins to reveal itself more clearly. Some conversations naturally continue because there is mutual presence. Others start to fade because they were being sustained by effort that is no longer being supplied. This is where the idea of losing people is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like the empath social circle is shrinking, like they are becoming more isolated or less interested in maintaining relationships. But if you look at the underlying process, it's not about losing connection. It's about removing what was never fully connected to begin with. The empath is no longer compensating for the lack of depth or alignment in certain interactions. They stop carrying the emotional weight of conversations that were always one-sided. And when that support is removed, the structure of those relationships begins to collapse on its own. A clear pattern emerges during this phase. The relationships that relied on the empath being consistently available, consistently understanding, consistently accommodating, start to weaken. Not because of conflict, but because the imbalance becomes visible. Without the empath overextending to keep things stable, there is nothing holding the dynamic together. On the other hand, the few connections that do have mutual awareness, where both people are present, engaged, and emotionally consistent, tend to remain. In some cases, they even become stronger. What changes is not the empath's capacity to connect, but the criteria for what qualifies as a connection worth maintaining. This process can feel uncomfortable, especially in the beginning. There's often a period where the reduction in interaction creates a sense of emptiness, not because the empath misses the specific people or conversations, but because there is suddenly more space than they're used to. Social habits don't disappear instantly. The mind is still accustomed to a certain level of engagement, even if that engagement wasn't fulfilling. So when that noise is removed, the silence can feel unfamiliar, but over time, that space begins to stabilize. What initially feels like absence starts to feel like clarity. There is less distraction, less emotional fluctuation, less need to constantly adjust to external input. Another important shift happens in how the empath interprets social value. Previously, there may have been an unconscious belief that more interaction equals more connection, that staying engaged, being present, maintaining relationships is inherently positive. But as this filtering process continues, that assumption begins to break down. The empath starts to see that not all interaction is equal. Some exchanges are neutral, some are draining, and a small number are genuinely energizing, and once that distinction becomes clear, it no longer makes sense to treat all interactions the same. Time and attention become more selective, not out of arrogance or detachment, but out of precision. This is why the term filter is more accurate than withdrawal. The empath is not stepping away from people as a whole. They are refining their environment. They are removing variables that create noise and instability and keeping only what contributes to a sense of alignment. It's a process that happens naturally when awareness reaches a certain level. There is no need to force it, no need to justify it externally. The behavior adjusts on its own because the internal system no longer tolerates the previous level of inconsistency, and over time, this leads to a very different kind of social structure. Fewer people, fewer interactions, but significantly more stability. There is less performance, less need to manage impressions, less emotional volatility. The connections that remain tend to operate on a different level, where communication is more direct, more consistent, and less dependent on maintaining a certain image. That doesn't mean every interaction becomes perfect or deeply meaningful, but it does mean that the baseline has shifted. The empath is no longer surrounding themselves with whatever is available. They are surrounding themselves with what aligns. From the outside, this can still be misinterpreted. It can look like distance, like disinterest, like a lack of effort. But from the inside, it's the opposite. It's a more deliberate, more accurate way of engaging with the world. The empath is no longer trying to maximize the number of connections. They are optimizing for the quality of those connections. And once that shift is in place, the idea of going back to a larger, less filtered, social circle no longer feels appealing. It feels unnecessary, because what was removed was never adding value in the first place. It was just occupying space. When people talk about empaths absorbing energy, it often gets framed in a way that sounds vague or mystical, which makes it easy to dismiss. But if you look at it through a behavioral and physiological lens, there's a much more grounded explanation. Some individuals have a nervous system that is highly responsive to social and emotional cues, meaning they don't just observe what others are feeling. Their body begins to mirror it almost automatically. This isn't a conscious choice, and it doesn't require intention. It's a built-in mechanism where external emotional signals are rapidly translated into internal states. So, when an empath is around someone who is anxious, tense, frustrated, or emotionally unstable, their system starts to register and process those signals as if they were their own. This is where the experience becomes very different from what most people are used to. For the average person, social interaction is relatively contained. They can notice that someone is in a bad mood without it significantly altering their own internal state. There is a level of separation between observation and experience, but for someone with heightened sensitivity, that separation is reduced. The boundary between what I'm feeling and what the environment is projecting becomes more permeable. And as a result, being in certain environments is no longer neutral. It becomes an active process of regulation. The empath is not just participating in the interaction, they are constantly adjusting, compensating, and stabilizing in response to the emotional signals around them. Over time, this creates a very specific kind of fatigue. It's not the kind that comes from physical exertion or even mental effort in the traditional sense. It's more subtle, but also more persistent. After spending time in a group, or even in a one-on-one interaction with someone who carries a lot of unresolved tension, The empath may walk away feeling depleted, not simply tired, but as if their internal resources have been drained, and in many cases, they don't immediately understand why. The conversation might have seemed normal on the surface. Nothing overtly negative may have happened, but their system has been working the entire time, processing, adapting, and attempting to maintain equilibrium in an environment that is not stable. A useful way to understand this is to look at how regulation works. Most people regulate their emotional state primarily from within. Their baseline remains relatively consistent regardless of minor fluctuations in the environment. An empath, on the other hand, often regulates in response to the environment. That means their internal state is more directly influenced by the people they are around. If the environment is calm, grounded, and consistent, they tend to feel the same way. But if the environment is chaotic, tense, or emotionally fragmented, their system mirrors that as well. And because this process happens quickly and repeatedly, it accumulates. This is why certain interactions feel disproportionately draining. It's not about the duration of the interaction, it's about the quality of the emotional signals being processed. A short conversation with someone who is internally conflicted or emotionally inconsistent can have a greater impact than a longer interaction with someone who is stable and aligned. The empath is effectively doing continuous micro-adjustments, tracking inconsistencies, reconciling mixed signals, and maintaining a sense of coherence internally while the external environment lacks it. That level of processing requires energy, even if it's not consciously recognized as effort in the moment. Eventually, the pattern becomes clear. The empath starts to notice that the way they feel after an interaction is not random. There is a direct correlation between the type of person they engage with and the state they are left in afterward. Some people leave them feeling steady, clear, even energized. Others consistently leave them feeling unsettled, tense, or drained. Once that connection is recognized, it changes the way future interactions are approached. Social engagement is no longer just about interest or obligation. It becomes a question of impact. What does this interaction do to my internal state? Is it neutral, stabilizing, or depleting? This is where behavior begins to shift in a more intentional way. The empath doesn't necessarily confront or label what's happening outwardly, but internally, they start making adjustments. They limit exposure to environments that consistently create imbalance. They become more selective about how long they stay in certain situations. They pay closer attention to the early signals their body is giving them, rather than overriding those signals to maintain social harmony. What used to be ignored or tolerated starts to become information that guides decision-making. From the outside, this can easily be misinterpreted as withdrawal or sensitivity in a negative sense. But in reality, it's a form of calibration. The empath is learning to recognize that not all environments are equal, and that their system responds differently depending on where they are and who they are with. Continuing to expose themselves to situations that repeatedly create internal disruption is no longer seen as resilience. It's seen as a lack of self-awareness. So they adjust, not out of fear, but out of accuracy, and once that level of awareness is in place, it's difficult to go back to a more passive way of engaging. Because the cause and effect relationship has become too clear to ignore. The empath understands, through repeated experience, that their environment directly shapes their internal state, and when that becomes undeniable, protecting that environment stops being optional. It becomes a necessary part of maintaining stability. What used to be described vaguely as absorbing energy is, in practice, a highly responsive system interacting with an unstable environment. And the more clearly that system is understood, the more deliberately it begins to operate. Once the empath begins to clearly see the connection between their environment and their internal state, their behavior starts to shift in a way that is much more deliberate. This isn't an emotional reaction or a sudden withdrawal from people. It's a strategic adjustment based on repeated observation. They've gathered enough evidence to recognize that certain interactions consistently leave them drained, unsettled, or internally fragmented, while others leave them stable and clear. And once that pattern becomes undeniable, continuing to engage the same way as before no longer makes sense. So instead of asking how to maintain every relationship or stay socially active, the question changes into something far more precise. What is the cost of this interaction? And is it worth it? This is where the reduction in contact begins. But it doesn't happen in an obvious or confrontational way. The empath doesn't announce it, doesn't necessarily explain it, and often doesn't even fully articulate it to themselves at first. It shows up in small decisions that accumulate over time. They start declining invitations that they would have automatically accepted before. They become more selective about where they go, who they spend time with, and how long they stay. Conversations that once would have continued out of politeness are now allowed to end naturally. They stop extending themselves just to keep the interaction going. And in doing so, they begin to reclaim a level of control over their environment that wasn't there before. From the outside, this shift is easy to misinterpret. People may assume disinterest, distance, or even a change in personality. Someone who was once consistently available, engaged, and responsive is now less present, less reactive, more reserved. But what looks like withdrawal is actually a form of refinement. The empath is no longer operating on autopilot, responding to every social opportunity as it appears. They are filtering those opportunities based on impact, and that filter is not based on external factors like status, history, or obligation. It's based on something much more immediate and accurate: how the interaction affects their internal state. One of the most important changes during this phase is the shift from external validation to internal feedback. Previously, the empath may have relied, at least in part, on social expectations to guide their behavior, accepting invitations, maintaining contact, staying engaged. These actions often align with what is considered normal or appropriate, but once the cost of certain interactions becomes clear, those external guidelines lose their influence. The empath begins to prioritize internal signals instead. If something feels consistently draining, that becomes enough information to reduce or eliminate exposure, regardless of how the decision might be perceived by others. This is also where boundaries start to form in a more functional way, not as rigid rules or declarations, but as consistent behavioral patterns. The empath doesn't need to explain why they're leaving early or why they're not as available. The behavior itself becomes the boundary. They limit time in environments that create tension. They reduce engagement with people who consistently require more emotional output than they contribute. They stop volunteering energy in situations where there is no reciprocal awareness. And because these adjustments are based on direct experience rather than abstract principles, they tend to be more stable over time. There is, however, a transitional period where this change can feel uncomfortable. Reducing contact often creates space, and that space can initially feel unfamiliar. The empath may question whether they're becoming too distant or too selective. They may notice that their social world is becoming quieter and wonder if that quiet is a problem that needs to be solved. But as the process continues, the quality of that quiet begins to change. What initially feels like absence starts to feel like relief. There is less emotional noise, less need to constantly adjust, less exposure to dynamics that create internal friction. The system stabilizes, and with that stability comes a clear sense of what actually feels right. Another effect of this shift is that tolerance for misalignment decreases significantly once the empath has experienced what it feels like to be in an environment that doesn't drain them, where interactions are more consistent and less demanding. The contrast becomes very clear. Situations that were once tolerated now stand out immediately. The difference between neutral, supportive, and draining interactions is no longer subtle, and because of that, the threshold for what is acceptable changes. The empath is no longer willing to endure the same level of inconsistency or imbalance simply to maintain a connection. At this stage, social behavior becomes highly intentional. Fewer interactions, but each one is chosen with a specific awareness of its impact. The empath is no longer trying to maximize contact. They are trying to maintain equilibrium. And this is where the idea of protection becomes accurate, not in a defensive or fearful sense, but in a practical one. When your internal state is strongly influenced by your environment, managing that environment becomes a necessary part of maintaining stability. Exposure is no longer neutral, so it has to be regulated. What emerges from this process is not isolation, but control. The empath is not stepping away from people entirely. They are eliminating unnecessary interference. They are reducing variables that create instability and focusing only on interactions that are either neutral or beneficial. And while this can result in a smaller social circle, it also results in a more stable internal state. Less fluctuation, less depletion, more clarity. The trade-off becomes clear. Fewer interactions in exchange for better ones, less noise in exchange for more coherence. And once that balance is established, it becomes the new baseline. The empath no longer sees constant social engagement as something to strive for. Instead, they recognize that not all interaction is equal, and that reducing exposure can be just as important as seeking connection. The goal is no longer to be surrounded by people, but to be in environments that support, or at least do not disrupt, their internal state. And that shift, while subtle on the surface, fundamentally changes how they move through the world. One of the most overlooked aspects of empathy is not how deeply someone can understand others, but what happens when that understanding exists without clear boundaries. In theory, being able to see the underlying reasons behind someone's behavior sounds like a strength, and in many ways it is. Empaths tend to recognize patterns that others miss. They notice emotional wounds beneath reactions. They understand why someone withdraws, becomes defensive, or acts inconsistently. But in real-world relationships, this ability often creates a subtle imbalance that builds over time. Because when you consistently understand people more than they understand themselves, you also become more willing to tolerate behaviors that should have been addressed earlier. This is where overgiving begins. And it rarely feels like a mistake in the moment. The empath listens longer, explains more, gives the benefit of the doubt, and assumes that with enough patience, clarity will eventually lead to change. When someone reacts poorly, They don't immediately take it at face value. They look for context. When someone fails to meet expectations, they search for underlying reasons rather than drawing boundaries. And while each of these responses makes sense individually, together they create a pattern where the empath is constantly adjusting themselves to maintain the relationship. The effort becomes one-sided, but it doesn't always register that way at first, because the empath is focused on understanding, not measuring balance. Over time, however, the effects start to accumulate. The relationship continues, but not on equal terms. One person is consistently providing emotional stability, absorbing tension, and smoothing over inconsistencies, while the other is, consciously or not, relying on that dynamic. The empath becomes the one who regulates the interaction. They are the one who keeps things from escalating, who interprets what was meant rather than what was said, who compensates for gaps in communication, and because they are capable of doing this, it becomes expected. Their flexibility turns into a default setting within the relationship. The more they give, the less it is recognized as effort, and the more it is treated as something that will always be there. This is how the imbalance becomes normalized. There is no clear moment where the relationship is defined as unequal. Instead, it evolves into that state gradually, through repeated interactions where one side consistently contributes more than the other. The empath may begin to notice small signals, a lack of reciprocity, a pattern where support flows in one direction, where understanding is not returned at the same level. But even then, the instinct is often to rationalize it. They might tell themselves that the other person is going through something, that things will improve, that not everyone processes emotions the same way. And while these explanations are not necessarily wrong, they delay a more accurate assessment of the situation. Eventually, repetition creates clarity. The empath starts to see that the same patterns are occurring again and again, regardless of context. Apologies are made, but behavior doesn't change. Attention is given, but only when needed. The relationship remains stable on the surface, but only because one person is continuously stabilizing it. This is the turning point, because at this stage, the empath has enough information to recognize that the dynamic is not temporary, it's structural. The imbalance is not an exception, it's the way the relationship functions. What makes this realization difficult is that it challenges a core belief that understanding someone should lead to a better outcome. For a long time, the empath operates under the assumption that if they can see clearly enough, communicate well enough, and remain patient long enough, the other person will eventually meet them at the same level. But experience begins to contradict that assumption. They start to see that understanding does not create change unless the other person is also willing to engage at that level. And without that mutual effort, the empath's continued investment doesn't improve the relationship, it sustains the imbalance. Once that distinction becomes clear, behavior begins to shift, often quickly. The empath stops over-explaining. They stop justifying other people's actions internally. They reduce the amount of emotional energy they invest in situations where there is no indication of reciprocity. And most importantly, they begin to separate two concepts that were previously linked: understanding and tolerance. They realize that being able to see why someone behaves a certain way does not obligate them to accept or remain in that behavior. This is where many relationships begin to change, or end entirely, not because of conflict or confrontation, but because the dynamic that sustained them is no longer being maintained. When the empath withdraws the extra effort, the imbalance becomes visible. Some people adjust and meet the new boundary. Others don't. And without the empath compensating, the connection weakens or disappears. From the outside, it can look sudden, as if the empath has become distant or changed unexpectedly. But in reality, the change has been building over time. And what is being removed is not the relationship itself, but the excess effort that was holding it together. What remains after this process is a more accurate reflection of which connections are mutual and which were conditional. The empath begins to see clearly where their energy is being met and where it is simply being used. And with that clarity comes a different standard. They are no longer willing to invest at a level that is not returned, not out of resentment, but out of precision, because once you have experienced the long-term effects of overgiving in an imbalanced system, continuing to do so is no longer interpreted as kindness. It is recognized for what it is, a form of self-neglect that, over time, becomes unsustainable. There comes a point where the accumulation of all these patterns stops being something the empath can quietly manage and starts becoming something they can no longer ignore. It's not a sudden emotional reaction, not a moment of frustration or burnout, but a shift in perception that feels unusually clear after enough experiences of misalignment, after enough interactions that required extra effort to stabilize, after enough relationships where giving was not matched, the empath reaches a level of accuracy that changes how they interpret everything moving forward. What used to be seen as isolated situations are now recognized as consistent structures. And once something is seen as a pattern instead of an exception, the response to it naturally changes. This is the turning point. Not because something new happens, but because the same things are now being understood differently. The empath begins to see that many of the dynamics they were participating in were never balanced to begin with. They were sustained by their willingness to adapt, to absorb, to give more than was being returned. And as soon as that willingness is questioned, the entire framework of those relationships becomes unstable. This is where a simple but critical distinction forms. Understanding someone does not require continuing to tolerate the impact of their behavior. For a long time, those two ideas were linked. The empath believed that if they could see the underlying cause, they should also remain patient and accommodating, but experience breaks that connection. They realize that insight without boundaries leads to depletion, not connection. Once that realization settles in, behavior begins to change in a way that is both quiet and decisive. The empath stops responding automatically. Instead of engaging out of habit or expectation, they begin to pause and evaluate, not in a dramatic or analytical way, but through a simple internal check. Does this interaction align with how I want to feel, or does it consistently disrupt that state? If the answer is clear, the response becomes equally clear. They reduce involvement, limit exposure, or in some cases, disengage entirely. And unlike earlier stages, where there may have been hesitation or second-guessing, this phase carries a different kind of certainty. The decision is not based on emotion, it's based on accumulated evidence. This is also where boundaries become fully operational, not as something that needs to be explained or negotiated, but as a natural extension of behavior. The empath doesn't need to justify why they are less available, less responsive, or more selective. The shift is reflected in what they do, not what they say. They no longer feel the need to maintain every connection or preserve every dynamic. If something consistently creates imbalance, it is adjusted or removed, And because this process is grounded in repeated experience rather than abstract rules, it tends to be consistent and sustainable from the outside. This stage is often misunderstood more than any other. People who were used to the empath's previous level of availability and flexibility may interpret the change as distance, indifference, or even rejection. The empath, who once explained, accommodated, and maintained stability, now appears more reserved, more controlled, and less willing to engage on demand. But what is being perceived as withdrawal is actually precision. The empath is no longer distributing their energy evenly across all interactions. They are allocating it based on alignment, and that shift disrupts any relationship that depended on their previous overextension. As this recalibration continues, another layer of change begins to take shape. The empath's priorities shift away from maintaining connection at any cost and toward building a life that feels internally consistent. The question is no longer, how do I stay connected? But, what kind of environment allows me to remain stable, clear, and aligned? This is a fundamental change in orientation. Instead of adjusting themselves to fit into existing dynamics, they begin to evaluate whether those dynamics fit them, and in many cases, the answer leads to further simplification, fewer environments, fewer interactions, fewer obligations that are not aligned with their internal state. What replaces the previous structure is not isolation, but a different standard for connection. The relationships that remain are not based on proximity, history, or expectation, but on mutual awareness. There is less need for explanation, less need for interpretation, because there is less inconsistency to manage. Communication becomes more direct. Interactions require less effort to maintain, and the overall dynamic is more stable. The empath is no longer compensating for gaps. So, the connections that survive this process are the ones that can stand without that extra support. Perhaps the most significant shift happens internally. The need for external validation begins to lose its influence. For a long time, social behavior may have been partially guided by a desire to belong, to maintain harmony, to be seen in a certain way. But after experiencing the cost of misaligned connections, that trade-off becomes less appealing. The empath begins to value internal coherence over external approval. The sense of being at peace with one's environment, of not having to constantly adjust or filter, becomes more important than being included in every interaction. And once that value is established, it tends to remain. At this point, the empath is no longer reacting to what is available. They are choosing what aligns. Every interaction, every environment, every relationship is evaluated through a simple but effective lens. Does this support my stability, or does it disrupt it? If it disrupts it consistently, it doesn't stay. And while this results in a smaller, more selective social structure, it also creates something that was not present before: a sense of control, not over other people, but over their own internal state and the conditions that influence it. And once that level of clarity is reached, the idea of returning to a less selective, more reactive way of living no longer feels necessary. It feels inaccurate.